My name is Sven Hjert, and I joined the Jutlandia in 1951. No, that's not correct. That was the first trip when the ship left Copenhagen. I joined Jutlandia sailing from Copenhagen 19th of September in 52. And I had asked for a job on board Jutlandia already in 1950, when it was decided from the Danish Foreign Ministry that Denmark would send a hospital ship to Korea. I was at that time I was in India, but I sent a telegram back to East Asiatic Company, which owned the ship, that if they could need me, I was ready to volunteer for a job as engineer on board the ship. But as it was normal custom in EAC at that time, I never heard an answer for it. So it took until September 52 before I all of a sudden was called in with about 3 days notice. So I had to pack up all my clothes in a hurry and go to the ship, which was laying down at Langelinie, where the memorial, the Danish Veterans Memorial, are placed only a few meters from the place where Jutlandia left Copenhagen. Strange enough, we sailed, and strange enough, we sailed 19th of September, and it was my birthday, 28th of September. So at that time, during that short period, very fast we learned each other to know on board the ship. And one day when I was on the deck looking at what happened on the sea and so on, there were 3 nurses standing also there. I guess they were standing there and I walked there probably the way we did it. And among them there were a young nurse which I was going to learn later on. But we talked about it and I said, told them it was my birthday the day after, and they said, "Oh, well, we'll come. I said, "Oh, that's a very good idea. You can join me tomorrow morning. I'm finished in the engine room at 4 o'clock in the morning." Oh, well, that was a little bit early, and they couldn't do that. That would not be allowed, and they were very shy at that time. After a year or two, it had left most of them. So, but that was the first time I met this young. She was the second youngest nurse which had signed on board the ship. There were very strict rules and very strict what you call it. They should at least be 25 years old, and they should have been nurses for so and so long, and they have worked with operations and other things from a hospital. So it was very trained and very clever nurses that were on board. But then we sailed further on, and it was a fantastic experience for for the crew, for the young doctors and for the nurses when we came to the Mediterranean and later on through the Suez Canal, and because it was so close after all, it was so close from the Second World War and the German occupation of Denmark that they had never been abroad from Denmark, all these, only very few. So it was the great, everything was new for all these people. Well, we came through Suez Canal and went to Sri Lanka, or to Ceylon, as it was its name. It was its name at that time. And then it happened that I went ashore for a few hours in Ceylon, and I met 3 nurses up there. That was, of course, the same nurses as I had met first time. And they were a little bewildered. They didn't know what to do. They had never been away. So I said, well, wouldn't you care for a drink or something in this heat down there? Yes. But I said, well, I know there's a fine hotel here. We can go and have a drink. What do you want to drink? They didn't know because none of them were used to have drinks, but one of them had been ashore in Southampton, which we had called, where we had called on the way out, and she said, "Oh, I will have a gin and tonic." And so all of a sudden, all 3 wanted a gin and tonic. So we got that, and we sat in this hotel and had half an hour or so, and among them were also this nurse again. We left Ceylon, where we called for fresh water and oil and other kind of supports for the ship, and we came to Singapore, where we also called in, and Singapore there were possibility for the nurses and doctors, for the hospital staff, they were allowed to go ashore as much as they wanted because there were no passengers at that time. So, and I was so happy I could have a few hours off, and I went ashore to buy a few things, and of course I met three nurses carrying parcels and everything. It was really an adventure for them to be in Singapore, and Singapore was a wonderful city, at least at that time, well it still is. And I said, have you been at Raffles Hotel? No. Said, well, you go to Raffles Hotel and have a drink. You can't be in Singapore without having been at Hotel Raffles. That was the most important hotel there, and it was from back the colonial time, from when Great Britain, when Singapore belonged to Great Britain. But I said, well, I'm going on board now, I'm having a taxi. What about all these purses and all these things? Shouldn't I bring them on board, and so you can go to Raffles and have a nice time? I did so, and that was good. That was the third time I met the same nurse. And well, then we came to, we left Singapore and came to Yokosuka in Japan, which was the naval base for United States ships. And we didn't see much to each other then after that, because from there, after a few days in Japan, we sent to Busan, And a few hours after arrival to Busan, we got the first patients, first wounded soldiers. And so everybody had their business to do, so there were no shopping or no possibility to meet each other very much. But then New Year's Eve, we were invited for the 1st of January. We were invited to a reception by the American commanding general in a place which the American soldiers and especially the officers where they met very often. I don't know, it was called Old Ironsides. Why, I don't know, but that was the name of this place, and everybody who could leave the Jutlandia participated in this reception, and there were speeches and so on. And the day before, I met this young nurse, and I said, well, are you going to the reception tomorrow? Oh, well, yes, I think so. I said, well, have you company? Are you meet some of your friends or your colleagues from the cabin or so? No, I have no. What about, shouldn't we join, and will you follow me? Oh, yes, I would like to. So that was, in fact, the first time I had a chance to sit. We came in, there were there were hundreds of people there, and we had a nice, a very nice reception, very nice day there, and we have much fun because there were a lot of American officers at the same table. And Americans are very polite, so whenever after a few hours one or two ladies were needed to go outside for a few minutes, and every time all the Americans stood up, and when they came back they stood up and sat down, and these old chief surgeons from Denmark, he said, "Oh well, but how are we going to stand up every time one of the nurses has to go out?" They were not used to so much politeness. So it ended up with that the nurses barely tried, or they were. Oh, sorry, my brain and my English is not what it has been, but they stayed at the table until the last minute. So that was actually the first time we had to speak together and have a nice time. So. But then later on, we had our work. But when we were in Korea, in Incheon, we were anchored in Incheon. We started up the first two trips with Jutlandia. The ship were in Busan, but. Then the second trip went to the first trip. We called Jutlandia service in Korea in 3 different trips. The first trip was we were sent by Allied Command to Europe, or actually to Ethiopia, to Turkey, Greece, France, Rotterdam, with wounded, and it turned in Rotterdam and immediately back to Korea. But then the second time, the Allied Command said, now you go to Europe again. We took the same route, but from Rotterdam we went to Copenhagen because we should have helicopter deck made on it, and we should have some air condition because the temperature in the operating rooms were up to 40 Celsius during the summertime in Korea. So we, and that was the chance for me to join Jutlandia. That was when it was finished with helicopter deck and all that. We started back to Korea 19th of September. And strange enough, that was the same date when this nurse, which I later learned to know, she also joined the ship. She had asked for it before in Red Cross, but she was too young at that time. She was not 25. But now, the third trip, she had passed 25, and she was taken as a nurse on board. She was, at that time, she had been a military nurse in the Danish army. So she was very well equipped for the job on board Jutlandia. But it was strange that we had both asked before to join Jutlandia, but first at the second trip, the third trip, we were allowed to join ship. And that was, I think, some strange coincidence that we were both had sought for it and both were first allowed to join it in September 52. But well, we jumped a little bit in it, but later in Incheon, we didn't have much chance to meet each other or to speak or to, as you saw in the Jutlandia Hall Museum, there were not much possibility, and in fact the nurses were not allowed to go to the officers' area. I don't know why, but there must have been some reason for that they wouldn't allow nurses to go there. And so we had each our job after this 1st of January session in Old Ironside. But I happened to have I can't remember, probably a Saturday or Sunday, where we could go ashore, and we went to Kamakura. That was when the ship was in Japan. Every 6 weeks, the Danish and the American ships, one by one, were sent to Korea, to Japan, with a full ship of wounded soldiers, which then were sent from Japan. The very much wounded soldiers were flown home to either to Hawaii or directly to USA, and when we were in Japan, we had to take care of the engine all the engines, because we were not allowed. We should be able to leave Incheon, the road of Incheon, with only half an hour's notice in case something happened, or in case the North Koreans should have still found an airplane which could attack. So we had this chance, and well, then I dared to invite this nurse for a trip to Kamakura, which is a huge Buddha figure in not very far from Yokosuka in Japan. Very impressive. We had a very nice day. That was the first time we had a full day on our own, and that was that was, what was it, 10th of January. Yes, I still remember because that was the first time that we felt sympathy for each other, and we was by the train and bus from this place down to the air base in Yokosuka, but it ended at the gangway, so there were no possibilities to go further on board the ship. So then we from that time off, it was we didn't see much to each other. We met on the deck sometimes, but that was all. And we came home the 23rd of October when the armistice negotiations had finally not ended the war, because the war is still existing actually, but there is an armistice, what you call a situation. But when we came home, I was still in East Asiatic Company, but we kept writing letters to each other. My wife was in a large army camp as chief nurse, and we kept contact as well as we could. I was in East Asiatic Company, and she was in her work. But after a year or thereabout, we found out that a marriage was the right things to do, and we asked a former priest from Jutlandia, who has served as what you call a vicar on Jutlandia, whether he would marry us, and he said with greatest pleasure. And we were married in Skovshoved Kirke, which we passed today. We were married, but the ship, at the time when we found out the date and so on, but when the church was ready to receive us, we were in the second biggest city in Denmark, in Aarhus, in Jutland. And we phoned to the vicar and said, well, what about, it's a Saturday, can you take us? Well, anytime, he said. Yes, but we are both of us in Aarhus at the moment. We don't know if something happens or if weather is bad or so, we don't come. Well, never mind, we'll find out. And now my wife, I think that was a little bit silly that she was going by train back to Copenhagen and I was sailing. I said, why don't you stay on board and I'll lock you into my cabin. And so you can sail with me to Copenhagen. Okay, that was fine. That was fine. We found out, and we were married. Only very few, because none of the family or anything. I phoned my brother and said, well, just to tell you, I'm going to be married tomorrow in there in this church, and so couldn't you arrange some dinner or something for us? Or not he, but he and his wife. Oh yes, we'll fix everything. So there were only, my wife had 4 sisters, and only one of them were able to reach our wedding. And there were, I think we were 6 or 7 or so to the wedding, but it was enough, and both parties said yes. So it was all right, and I still remember we walked out of the church. Now I was an old, my trousers were not, because everything was so fast, and she said, oh, well, I've saved money for a wedding dress, and now look what I look at. I said, well, that's not very important. The important is that we have said yes, both of us. And we walked out, we were still in the 777, walked down to down in the church and into the våbenhuset, I don't know it in Danish, but there was a small room just before you leave the church, and there was the church woman who take care of everything, and we were both well high up, and she said, "Oh, congratulations, so wonderful!" And then I used to get some money for the for the problems I've had. So I told the vicar afterwards what she said. He said, "Oh, well, that's impossible." But we had to pay her a little bit for the wedding. She had not participated in anything. So that was our marriage, and since then we were married for more than 50 years. And after, when was that? We were married, well, 4-5 years after our marriage, we had our first son, and he wanted to join East Asiatic Company on a business, to be educated as a businessman, but normally that was not allowed because in the East Asiatic Company it was not allowed that hvad hedder medarbejdere?
The crew or the staff?
The staff of the East Asiatic Company were not allowed any sons or daughters, or no, there were no women in East Asiatic at that time, but they were not allowed to let their sons into work in the same company. But at that time, our son, he had, we gave him a trip to United States, to the
college,
to the university, and he asked me, would you prevent me to join East Asiatic? No, I would be happy, but you will not be allowed. But I was in shipping, and he was in the business department. So that was the meaning with them, from East Asiatic, that he should be in this part of the business. And they told him, well, we can tell you next year. I can't wait for that. He said, oh, we are not used to that way in the East Asiatic Company. So he said, well, I'm leaving for United States for 1 year, and if I do not know whether I can join East Asiatic, I will have to when I come home, I will have to seek some other places. But he was very, very well educated, so he came back and he joined East Asiatic Company, and he was educated there and finished, and were ready to join some of our offices all over the world. But unfortunately, he died when he was 22 years old by something in a brain aneurysm was the Latin name for it. So that spoiled a little bit. My wife never came over the loss of this loss. We got 5 years later. We had our second son, which I'm fortunate to have today. But unmarried, but heavy engaged in Stockholm. So yes, so I think we should take a pause now. Well, kind of impressed of the story. So that was the reason he made the song. The song is free. It's not correct, but that's never mind. He said it was in 1949, and nurses 16 years old, they had to be 25 years at least. So there were, but that's a freedom composer has. So
the artistic freedom.
The song was fantastic good at the time when it came, when he first made it and sung it, because a lot of young people in Denmark said all of a sudden, Jutlandia, what's that, Kim Larsen? We must know a little bit more about Jutlandia. And my wife was at that time, that was her last job as a nurse. She was a nurse in Magasin du Nord. That's it. Was the biggest warehouse in det hedder ikke warehouse. Hvad er Magasin?
Storehouses.
Yeah, I don't know, but I don't know whether you know, but that's something like Macy or something like that. And she was a chief nurse there for whole Denmark. It has a lot of smaller places. And she said when this song came, all the young people in this, there were at that time, I think 3,000 people working in this warehouse, this place. And they all came and said, they tell me you have been in Jutlandia. And so she was, all of a sudden, she was top of this warehouse. But so it had a very good mission to tell a new generation exactly the same. The picture is terrible, but it has been shown in television 12 times now. 12 times they have repeatedly. People phone me every time and say, de viser en film om Jutlandia i aften, så sagde jeg, det er nummer 12. Men, but it also has a mission, this picture, because people that see it today, they don't know how it was in reality, really in Korea. So it also has a mission, and I think that there is no people in Denmark now which doesn't know what Jutlandia means. So both the Kim Larsen and this one is important, but they are not true. They are full of false things, but that doesn't matter because it's very important. Kim Soo-hwan is on this film, and I'm also strange enough on this picture, but. Well, when the Korean War broke out, or actually when North Korea attacked South Korea, there was a meeting in the United Nations, and of course United Nations, thanks to a mistake from Russia, which had no vote at the Security Council at that time, the UN asked all countries in the world to work for South Korea, do something for South Korea, and 16 countries gave military support. Denmark had just finished the German occupation, which is not to compare with the Japanese occupation of South Korea, which was terrible and rough. It was hard in Denmark, but not to compare with the Japanese. But we were rather poor country. We had no forces at all. We couldn't defend ourselves. It was on top of the Cold War at that time. So the foreign ministry worked took very much care about not to attack Russia in any way. So they said, well, we can't help with military forces, and United States were not quite support with that. But we had no soldiers. We couldn't even defend ourselves at that time. And we had the Russian forces. They were 20 minutes away from Denmark in Poland and Eastern Germany. So they could have attacked Denmark in a matter of few hours. They had landing crafts all ready on the Polish and East German coast, and we had to go very, very easy with the helping South Korea. But according to Korean understanding, or what you would, I don't have the right word. Denmark was one of the first countries to give their support to South Korea. But we started up giving medicine. That was not enough. We started up a kind of a support one way or another, but it was not satisfied enough for United Nations, and especially not understandable very well, not for the USA forces. So finally we ended up with a chief doctor who was chosen by the foreign ministry, a chief doctor, to handle the negotiations, and his name was Lehmann, and his grandson is Danish ambassador in Korea today. That's strange, but that was finally, foreign ministry and UN and US accepted that we promised to send a hospital ship, and then they had to work to find a ship which was able in a short time to be transferred from a normal freighter or so to a hospital. So they chose East Asiatic Company's ship Jutlandia, which was a combined passenger and cargo ship, and it was on its road to New York. And strange enough, they forgot to inform the ship, the captain on the ship, Captain Kondrup, who was later to be captain on the hospital ship also. So when he came in and moored at the quays in New York, there were hundreds of photographers and journalists, and he said, "What the hell is happening?" He didn't know why all these people were there, because he didn't know that Jutlandia was chosen, and it was emptied immediately for passengers and cargo, and everything was just, and it returned as fast as possible to Korea, to Denmark, and went straight down to the shipyard, Nakskov shipyard, which had built Jutlandia in 1934. So, and they worked day and night, and they knew the ship because they had built it originally. So they had all papers and all work were ready when the ship arrived from New York. And that was that made it possible to leave Denmark again already 23rd of January. They had built a new helicopter deck. They had given, as I told, air condition and some other few repairs and things which they had missed when they were in Korea. So in that way that we made a humanitarian help and a Red Cross ship, and so we couldn't, Russia couldn't be mad of that. So that was the beginning for it. Many has asked, a lot of people ask us, why did you volunteer for Korea, for the Korean War, for Jutlandia? And I said that was not very strange. For instance, for my wife, she was from the southernmost part of Jutland, which for how many years? 64, nearly 40 years of occupation, the southern part of Jutland, of German occupation, and she know what it means for a small country to be occupied by a big country. So she had immediately volunteered for it, and as soon as I heard it, when I saw in the news we received on board the ship I was then, I was in the underground movement in Denmark, and I was arrested by Gestapo, the German Gestapo, during the war, but my action during the German occupation was very, very small, because I was in Elsinore and it was not allowed to make any sabotage or any killing or anything in that area, because that was the main area for Jews to go to Sweden. So we were no heroes at all, but I had felt Gestapo enough to know that we were only saved from the German occupation by the help of Allied forces, especially English and American forces. So it was my impression that we owed at least a little bit as a thanks for the help they gave us, and without their work and their mighty losses of soldiers, we could not be free. So now we couldn't say no when another small country asked for help. So it was many of the veterans on board had that impression that we ought to join Jutlandia, and we did that, and that was very fine. When the ship was repaired and furnished and was ready to leave Denmark, the journalists, the press, the media was very, very bad, because they said, well, the ship will sink before they reach the Mediterranean, because with 3 chiefs and a lot of chief doctors and professors, they would fight all of them before they reach very far away. One captain, one expedition chief, one hospital chief, and all these professors and doctors. That was impossible, but they were clever. They became more clever, because when we came home, there was no end of how beautiful it had been. So that was strange with the medias, but it was the reason that the Jutlandia, in my impression and in most people's impression, that it ended up as a success was definitely because in periods when there were not any severe war action between North and South Korea, all the nurses and the doctors they couldn't go idle without no work, and they said there are thousands of people ashore, which or in Pusan, where the ship was moored up. We want to take to be allowed to take civilians. Of course, Korean soldiers were welcome, but civilians and children were not allowed. But they said we will do that, either you like it or not. That was the Allied command which were against it, and Koreans has never forgotten that. Never. They well, you have this saying which goes through everywhere. We will never forget, and they have never forgotten anything. So that was the reason that we, in fact, our success. I was a first lieutenant engineer, as I told, but the praise, the reason that we became such a success, that was of course the hospital part, it was not. We brought the hospital from here to Korea, and we served in all kind of ways the hospital. But it was the doctors and the nurses who did the job, both for the soldiers, but also for the civilians as much. They had to sign that in case of heavy fighting, we had to send all civilians ashore, and children, of course. But we were lucky we were not in that situation. We had very, very short before the våbenstilstand nu. Armistice, ja, så glemmer jeg pludselig sådan et ord. Just before a few weeks before the armistice was signed, the Chinese, they attacked a part of the border, but unfortunately for the Chinese, they had just changed the Americans. All the American soldiers had been drawn back. They had been fighting very, very much in that area, and the Turks had taken over. And you know, when they smell blood, they really fight. So they ran right into the Turk forces, and the Turks, they lost 700, if I remember clearly, and more than, I think, 8,000 Chinese were killed in that fight. And then all fighting stopped at that moment. But at that time, it was nearly, it was just before the hospital had broken down. They had helicopters as fast as they could bring wounded people in, and it was discussed whether they should send out doctors from Denmark, but the doctors on board, although they knew that there was a risk, they worked up to more than 24 hours, just operating. Well, then they had few hours sleep and then down again. And same with the nurses; they worked all the day and night, and but they managed until the fighting stopped. But there were many things which we have to thank the hospital department for, because they performed miracles sometimes, and the old doctors or professors said, "Well, you can't operate anymore." Who's going to die? Which one are we not to operate on? And they said, "Well, yes, okay, go on as long as you can." Mm-hmm. So they performed miracles, mm-hmm. the doctors and nurses. So
how many in total doctors and nurses went?
There were, strange enough, there were a ship's crew of between 96 and 100, and there were between a hospital staff between I think it was 98 and 104, and so, because it changed very much how many there were, especially the hospital staff had to change. Professors could only join Jutlandia for maybe three months, so they were about 3 months, and some were half a year, and some were a whole trip. But there were many of them were faktisk on board all the time, and Jutlandia were under UN flag for 999 days before the UN flag were taken down in Copenhagen.
Did anyone die? Did any Danes die?
Yeah. How many? I think we had for all that time, I think we had 16 dead soldiers, and that was a fantastic record.
16 Danish died.
We had a visit. I was by phone one day.
No. How many Danish?
No one died.
No one died.
No one.
Okay.
No. We fought a war on first class.
Wow.
Because no one died. We had nothing to do on the front line. In fact, they were not allowed to it because they had Red Cross, so they were not to. But we were on board a ship, so there were no reason. We had nothing to do, and no one was killed on the way. As I told, the trip my wife and I were invited to from Incheon to Seoul. It took at that time, I can't remember, but I know today with 6 lanes, it takes just the same time to come from Seoul to Incheon than it took at that time on a very small road. So we had no casualties. In fact, well, we had a doctor who fell down the stairs, and he was operated, and the commander was also operated on board the ship, Captain Hammerik. He was, I don't know what it's called, so I have to tell it in Danish. Han blev opereret for hæmorrider, og der var hans, at that time, but I have to continue in Danish. At that time, his wife was a guest on board the ship. She was traveled to time, and she came up in the official big room for all the doctors, hvor hun overbragte en varm tak til alle. So, so that was, but when we had
for helping her husband.
But one of our patients in the dentist clinic was Syngman Rhee. He came very often, partly because he loved to come on board the ship, and then next to he had some trouble with his teeth, so he came but that was on the first trip, so I've never met him. But he was the first, one of the first patients in the dentist clinic.
Speaking of him, how many times did you go back to Korea, and what do you think of Korea and the Korean people, future of Korea?
Yes. Well, exactly as I said, we shall never forget. The Koreans tell us, and they never do, because they have arranged, although it's now more than 60 years ago, they still invite every year veterans to visit Korea, or as they say, revisit Korea, and I have been 5 times. I think I've been 5 times on revisit Korea, and that means that the veterans himself pay for the transport forth and back, but everything during 1 week in Korea, hotels and all things are paid for us there, and it's a very følelsesmæssig
Sensitive.
feelings.
Sentimental.
Sentimental. Yeah.
yeah.
Sentimental.
Every time we have visited Korea, a few times we have been through to visit Korean Association, Koreans Veterans Association, and but otherwise we have been in Panmunjom, and we have they don't know how they do so much for the veterans which come. Americans and Ethiopians has been there. One from Colombia has been there as on a revisit Korea, and it's very impressive. I was there first time after the war in 1984. We were about 40 veterans at that time, which joined the trip to Korea, and we were astonished when we came with the plane, because there was a real airfield, a real when during the war they had these iron plates they could land on, but now there was a real airport to receive us, and when we came around in Seoul, and so there were more than one bridge you could pass the river, and it was fantastic. There were already the first skyscrapers were built at that time, and then next time we came, we couldn't recognize it from the first time, because now the adventure and everything, especially we must say under Dictator Park, President Park, during his reign, he promoted business and shipyards and everything. Many things happened during his. He was a tough guy, but that was necessary, because South Korea were full of communists. Groups fighting, especially in the southwest part of South Korea. There were some terrible groups fighting. So, well, I guess he had to be pretty tough. But that was impressive to see the diligence and the fantastic work the Koreans had made in this. Not to talk about now when we were there. I was there last time in 2003. We couldn't recognize anything in Seoul. The time I told you before, when my wife and I was on the trip to Seoul, we should have something to eat. We could have eaten in the military camp, but we asked, and he said, "Well, there is. That's probably the only civil house with 2 floors. There is a restaurant." And we went to that, and we had our first Korean dinner. In this, the rest of Seoul was flat, nothing except some of official buildings taken over by military or administration in all ways. There were more, but that was a few houses only. So it was fantastic to see the way Korea recovered. Last time in the last period of the war, when we were in Korea, they regarded it would take about 100 years for Korea to recover. They did it in let's say 25 years and later. That was fantastic. So we are all of us. I think all our veterans has been in Korea at least one time after the war. They were extremely impressed. Not to talk about the new airport in Incheon now. That's when we came there after first time after it was built. It was one of the biggest airports in Far East. So you have really worked, but it's terrible that South Korea necessarily must use so extremely much money on defense with a big army and with everything, just because of this mad reign in North Korea. In North Korea, they don't take it very serious to use so much money for the army, because people just die of hunger. But in South Korea, just imagine what they could make for the money they use for arms and army. And when South Korea donates thousands of tons of rice to North Korea in bags where something of South Korea, that's all cut out of they are not allowed to show that it comes from South Korea, but they have given very, very much help to North Korea, and all they get instead of that's missiles and atom bombs and spies or tunnels under Panmunjom area where I can't remember how many. I think it's 8 tunnels they have found. So I think it's a completely mad situation in Korea. In fact, Denmark still has military in Korea, because they have observers, or what they call it, observation for the borderline. And I was in Korea in 2010, and I brought my son with me, and he has all his 50 years he has heard about Jutlandia and lived with Jutlandia from both mother and father, and he was very, very impressed. And while we were there with Revisit Korea, they celebrated the recovery of Seoul from North Korea, and we were at the Olympic Stadium. Fantastic show they turned up there, and what was it? What was my? Oh well, yes. I was invited for lunch with the president, so I felt that was very. Until I said, well, we were 150. We were 150 guests, so but still it was an honor to be invited together with all the other people. The day after, I and my son, we were invited to a dinner in the Danish embassy, and there were among other people, there were a Korean rear admiral. He was guest in the. We were only 16 people invited for this dinner, and I had a very nice talk with. I was in the Danish Navy too, and he told me, yeah, well, but you don't think. But I've been in Denmark. I said that's impossible. What was your ship out of course, or what happened since you ended up? No, he was inspecting. He was checking a submarine which was built in Germany, but the water was too low to test the submarine, so they had to go out north of Denmark to test the submarine. And on that occasion, they had to go into a Danish city, Frederikshavn, a Danish city in Denmark, to get some fuel or some other for the catering department there. And I said, oh well, that's funny. I said, because I was in England I was in the submarines myself. In England, I was in 6 months in the British submarine port. Oh, you have been in the submarine too, and he took off. He had it for I don't know what slipsnål hedder, but yes, for the ship. It was a submarine, so he gave it to me. I felt I was, it was nearly as big as a medal as that one, and we had a wonderful evening. And another Korean, I can't remember what his job, but he was a civil. In my entrance out here, there is a small picture with what's called calligraphy.
Calligraphy.
Yes,
That's the same word.
signed in, and you can see one who strives for something like it stands on the back of the picture. One who strives for life in a situation will probably die, but one who dies, he will live forever. And that's a typical Far East. I think that's about what I can
Yeah, it's perfect.
tell you
One
now.
last comment about what your future of Korea's peace and reunification.
I did not quite.
Korea's reunification. Do you think it could happen?
I will say I do not hope it will happen very fast. The best thing in my poor occasion, I think if it could go very slow, that they have a North Korea, but without all the Kim Il-sung dynasty. So by and by they could open up for business communication as they started, but he spoiled it with this industrial area they had for a period with South Koreans starting business in some area. But I think it would be a catastrophe if it happened like it did between East and Western Germany, because 20 millions or how many they are in North Korea, if they are not dead at that time, if they would flow into South Korea and eat and steal whatever they could find, I'm sure. So I certainly do not hope it comes as in a sudden way. It should be maybe 10 or 15 or even 20 years ahead that they get tired of it and they kind of a democratic reign in North Korea, but still exist as a country itself, as North Korea and South Korea, but on friendly terms, or more or less friendly terms, I would say. But I think that could be a way to start a new area in North and South Korea.
I think it would be possible with the new generation. I hope so too.
We have to hope for it. Not much. There's not much showing that way today with his atomic and missiles and all this. But I don't know how it should happen. Well, hopefully he dies within a few years. But then there will be some other one, probably one general or something like that who will take over. I think it's wonderful to be a dictator.
No.
So it's very, very difficult.
Okay.